Good morning. I'm Professor Meredith Terretta from the University of Ottawa, and I'm very excited to have this, to be chairing this panel, Climate Justice as Racial Justice, sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'm particularly excited because I have noticed in recent years at the ASA, there hasn't seemed to be enough panels on climate change. And so I'm really excited to be chairing this panel and to introduce to you the speakers for today. So we're going to follow the order on the program, and I'll introduce the speakers just before they speak. So I'll just introduce them one by one when it's their turn to speak. So we're going to start first with Dr. Olugbenga Samuel Falase from Leeds City University. He'll be presenting a paper on trading or saving African forests, forest governance, fear of uncertainty, and the politics of China-Africa relations. So Dr. Falase, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen now to make you access my PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm coming. I'm sorry, I'm trying to share my screen.
So there should be a bar at the bottom of your window where you click on the share screen.
Okay. All right.
There we go. It looks like it's starting.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be presenting briefly on trading or saving Africa's forest governance, fear of uncertainty, and the politics of China-Africa relation. Yeah. As a way of introduction, China-Africa relations is not a recent phenomenon. It has been in existence under Emperor Wuti of China in 141 to 87 BC. And during this time, Somalia and Kenya were the major trading partner of China. And this relationship came to a brief halt when European colonialism started. And it also reappeared again in 1949 when there was an establishment of People's Republic of China and the decolonization movement. And after that, in 1959, Egypt became the major trading partner of China. Now, why Africa? Africa, countries of the world love to trade with Africa because of the numerous natural and mineral resources that are present in Africa. Africa contributes about 30% of the global mineral resources, and each African country has an economic advantage in the production of one or two resources. For instance, for oil and gas, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Liberia are the major producers of oil and gas. The same thing in diamond, Democratic Republic of Congo and Sierra Leone are the major producer. Then for platinum, South Africa is a leading author. Gold, we'll be talking about South Africa, Ghana, Mali, as well as Tanzania. Then when you talk about forest, which is a focus here, about 70% of the continent forest cover can be found in Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, and Equatorial Guinea. And as a result of this, we all know the importance of forest in the world. So the focus of this paper is to examine China-African relation in the context of forest governance system. In other words, how is the China-African relation play out in the forest sector in Africa? Yeah, like I have said, this is just to confirm that each African country has been a leading producer in a particular resources in the world. Now, China-African trade relations, like I said, has been on for a long time. And China is the most important individual trade partner for African countries. In 2008, or let me say over the last 5 years, 2014 to 2018, Africa's total trade, that is export and imports, has been on the increase with China, while the total trade with other trade partners like the EU, Japan, Switzerland, and even Brazil has declined. And also in 2008, the largest exporter to China from Africa consists of Angola, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, excuse me. While also that same year in 2018, South Africa was the largest buyer of Chinese goods, followed by Nigeria and Egypt. So this is just to tell us that both partners, China and Africa, have benefited tremendously from trade relations. Now, China's Belt and Road Initiative is what was put forward to, to finance major infrastructural projects in Africa. And from this figure that I have here, as you can see, major projects have been heavily financed by China. For instance, the Mombasa and Chad standard railways, totaled $19.43 billion. This is a huge amount of money. And this has been financed, this was financed by China. Also, the Mozambique gas project, which worth $4.21 billion also was financed by China. Others are constructions of Dar es Salaam and Djibouti standard rail lines, which runs into billions of dollars, as well as the Coastal Railway and oil refinery in Nigeria. That's about $18.4 billion. There are also other projects that have been financed by China in the infrastructural sector, the financing, construction, and the major sector that are key to the development projects in African countries. Now, moving into China and Africa's forest. Africa, like I said, it's they have this forest cover, a large area of forest cover. And the importance of forests in Africa to mankind cannot be underestimated. From global forests that constitute 30% of the total land area, the proportion of African forest is 17%, and which also covers about 674 million hectares and holds 20% of the global forest carbon, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization 2016. So this shows that Africa's forest is very important. Also, talking about the importance of African forests, over 2/3 of Africans, 600 million people depend on forest for survival. So we cannot rule out that. And finally, Africa's forest is extremely rich in biodiversity, which comprises 40,000 to 60,000 of plant species. And all these importance cannot be ruled out because they are very germane to human life. Now, as an exchange for this multi-billionaire projects, China, has been extracting Africa's forests in large quantity. For instance, China consumes more than 400 million cubic meters of timber annually. And the exportation of timber has increased from 35% in 2000 to 78% in 2009. And as a result of this, China has been regarded as the wood workshop of the world. Another factor is the increased Chinese logging companies in African countries. Most of these Chinese companies are operating illegally, although they have the government approval at the initial stage, but later they overshoot the boundary by colluding with the local African elite to become concessionaire owner, the license owner of major logging companies in Africa. So Looking at the China exploitation from Africa and West Africa, we have, okay, this shows the import of rosewood logs. The major wood that China is interested in is the rosewood. You know, it's very important because of their various uses. So import of rosewood log into China by region of origin, you can see that for Africa, it's very large, and others from Asia, Asian countries. Then import of rosewood log from West Africa too. We have that of Nigeria on the rise and that of Benin Republic. So from January 2015 to December 2016, China has imported 61% of rosewood worth $840 million from West Africa. This is showing how Africa's forest major product has been consumed heavily by China. Then as a result of this extraction and consumption, China household foreign direct investments has increased from $1 billion to $30 billion in 10 years. That is from 204 to 214. One of the factors that also aid China's extraction and consumption of Africa's forests is the politics that is embedded in the timber or logs purchased by China. In other words, China purchases raw logs. And when they purchase raw logs, it means the price is always very cheap, you know, compared to when they purchase manufacturing goods. So at this point, when they purchase, the price is always very lower compared to when the logs has been used to manufacture a particular commodity. Then another factor that also aid China consumption in Africa's forests is the Chinese logging operation in Africa. I've said that earlier on. Most times, Chinese logging operation overshoots their boundary that they were given initially by the government. You know, they initially received government approval, but at the end of the day, we cannot rule out the role of local African elites, especially the local African contractors that are also in the forest governance system. That collusion cannot be ruled out. And as a result of all these factors, Africa has lost 3.9 million hectares of forest area in a year, also gathering a total loss of about 17 billion annually as a result of this extraction of Africa's forest. Now, African scholars remain skeptical about China's investments in Africa. You know, before China became the major trading partner of Africa, we had the West, the Western countries. But at the end of the day, the end result of Western investment, Western investment and relationship produce an exploitative relationship, a giant draft relationship, where in most cases, African countries are to face with stringent economic policies, you know, and at the end of the day, the economic situation of African countries move from bad to worse. So African scholars, some African scholars argue that this relationship is the Chinese investment is a rebranded form of Western capitalism. That is not going to lead us anywhere. It's not going to lead African anywhere. It's a rebranded form of Western capitalism. Some scholars in Africa also argue that no, this is better. China is than the Western countries. They debate and it's still on. So that has given African scholars that fear of uncertainty, a mixture of doubt that China in Africa has come to stay or is going to be another disappointment. Now, moving to Africa's bargaining power in infrastructural forest transaction. Well, we all know that China is very strong economically. And in talking about transaction of infrastructure and forest exchange, the economic power of China is superb in this context. And Africa's bargaining power only relies on the available natural resources to bargain in this. Yeah. And at the same time, China, adopts a take it or leave it approach whenever they come to the table to discuss. They adopt, according to SILE 2019, they adopt a take it or leave it approach. So it's always a problem for Africa leaders to confront Chinese representatives in this, China's representative in this negotiation table. And another issue here is the key actors in negotiation. Africans most times in forest governance context African governments use people from the top table, the politicians, for instance, or people from the Ministry of Budget, Ministry of Finance, not people that understand the literal effects of deforestation, for instance. The environmentalists, the foresters, or the scientists that know the importance of the environment, that know the importance of the deleterious effect of deforestation or degradation. So the major actors that are put or that are present in that negotiation table are people, politicians, ministers, people from the Ministry of Budget or Finance. So this is also one of the major issues in Africa's in bargaining with China. When
Dr. Falase, just 2-minute warning. 2-minute warning to conclude.
All right, thank you. So another issue is that more attention is being diverted to other resources more than forests, like oil. Get more attention in African countries than forests. So forest sector is mostly neglected. Now, quickly, trading or saving African forest. So far, the forest governance context, China-African relations has produced unbalanced relationship in the forest governance context. And for saving Africa's forest, there must be equal attention to forest governance like other resources. More attention, like I said, has been paid to oil and other natural resources. Then Africa, in this context, should adopt generalist approach in infrastructure forest bargain. Generalist approach, in other words, to involve those that understand and know the problems, that know how the environment behaves. The environmentalists, the foresters, they should be part of the key actors that will negotiate with China when issues like this occur. Then the African government should understand the symbiotic relationship between the environment and human lives. There's no point that all forests should go for infrastructure as an exchange for infrastructure. Some forests should be reserved, for people to enjoy, for people to survive on, because there are some local communities that rely on the forest for their survival. And finally, regulatory framework to enforce forest policies. There should be monitoring mechanism to regulate most Chinese logging companies not to overgo their boundary in Africa. And in conclusion, so far in China-Africa relation, in the context of forest governance, has produced greenish China and brownish Africa. Most of our Africa's forest has been used as an exchange for this multi-billionaire infrastructural projects. So as China is giving us development on one hand through the various investments, they are also contributing to the high rate of deforestation on the other hand, which has deleterious implication for Africa. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Falase. So we're moving on now to our next presenter, who is Dr. Brighton Nkrumah, postdoc at the University of Witwatersrand. So, he's presenting a paper entitled Ecojustice, Africa's Youth and Climate Justice. I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Nkrumah, which discipline, are you in an interdisciplinary program or are you in law?
No, I'm in multidisciplinary. So I tend to manage all fields. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, it seemed, it read very, very much like a legal scholar's paper, but I'm looking forward to hearing you present. Thank you very much.
So
you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Prof. And then thanks to, Olugbenga, that was an excellent presentation, well done. So first of all, let me just say, it is curious that I was, I've been given this opportunity to speak to such eminent scholars with regards to climate change and its impact on Africa's population, particularly with Africa's youth. But of course, there is a sense to which every African ought to be concerned because change on the continent, youth. And as I was thinking of this morning, as I was thinking of what to say, I actually reflected on a presentation which was made by Kenyan Salim Mazuri in the early 1980s. In his presentation titled The Africans, a Triple Heritage. And in one of those segments, where he actually labeled it the nature of a continent, Mazuri actually bemoaned, or he actually touted, the exploitation of the continent's resources without any attempt being made to replenish it. And then somehow his concern seems to have actually been driven by the continent's over-reliance on rain-fed agriculture. And then the possibility that if the forest, which we actually are cutting down, we don't actually replenish it, a time will come where the rains might not be as they are. And if I'm giving a little room to maneuver, I remember nostalgically, much in my much younger days in my village, where I used to accompany my father to farms. We will till the land in March, and then of course, expecting the rains to come. And then surely, although we didn't have shoes to wear, by the end of the harvest, we all get brand new shoes. And then I'm told actually by my old man that the rains don't come as they used to be, which has actually forced or compelled the youth, the young girls and young boys to flee the villages and flee the land to go to urban centers in pursuit of greener pastures, which of course is very difficult. So this somehow actually lead us to the emerging trend as to what is actually happening in terms of what climate change is actually impacting on the continent youth. But the question is, what does this trend phenomenon, what does it hold for youth? And the emphasis on youth is because any form of atrocity or any form of harm which happens to young generation is much more dire, is much more severe compared to adults. That is why the focus has been so much on youth. But if what does the future hold? What does climate change actually hold for the youth? And this response was actually provided by the IPCC, which actually articulated by 2050, which is over the next 3 decades, the drought that we are seeing is going to be worse. The floods are going to be worse. There is going to be very scarcity of food, which, if one should actually focus, how old will you be by then? And in the African Youth Charter, it is actually stated that a youth is someone who is between the age of 15 to 35. So if someone is 15 years by now, over the next 30 years, that person might be 45. And if at that time there is little food, there is less water, what is going to happen? There is a possibility that there's going to be water war, there is going to be food war, there's going to be instability of which the continent is already battling with. So actually, this is something which actually prompted South Africa's preacherman Desmond Tutu to actually come out and in one of his commentaries, in which he actually clearly articulated his fears for the future, and he actually mooted that if the ongoing climate change is not addressed, the continent poor are the ones who are going to be hit the most. And the question is that who are these poor? The poor, as we all know, is that in Africa, there is a large scale of inequality across Africa, where the elite is up there, and they have about 5% or 10% elite, and almost about 90% of the poor. So when food is so scarce, when water cannot be found, there is a possibility that those who actually do not have the means to actually get air conditioning to contain the heat is going to be actually plagued more. So it was against this backdrop that I actually tried to investigate or to actually assess to what extent what measures can actually be used to actually mitigate climate change. And if one should actually recall that there's this common saying which actually says that he who lives in a glass house of course, you can continue. And I believe Africans so far have actually done so so well in terms of emissions, because knowing that they will not be able to contain the heat, the continent happens to be the least emitter of greenhouse gases. But then, of course, one's action cannot always save one from this form of injustice. And as you know, the global, the international community is marked by the common trend that one bad apple can actually spoil the bunch. And it's just like having good friends and bad friends. Of course, Africans do have a lot of good friends, but of course, you might have some bad friends whose actions might actually impact on you. And I think that is a trend, something that we're actually suffering from the inactions of the United States, inactions of China, to actually cut down on their emissions. Because as you know, when someone was actually, I submitted my paper and someone was actually saying, can you prove that those in US or those in China are actually Chinese or Americans, and therefore they're actually impacting on Africans on the basis of race? And the simple argument here is that you might have a majority of residents in China might be Chinese, of course, and the majority in the US are Americans. And as citizens, and in line with the notions of democracy and sovereignty, they have the right to take whatever decisions that they deem fit through their representatives. So in China, the National People's Congress, or in the US Senate, can actually decide to pass a law and say, okay, let's consume much more fuel, let's consume much more coal, let's emit more gases. And that is within their sovereignty, it is within their right. However, the only problem then happens when their actions transcend their borders to another border, to another continent, which in this case, the high emissions or the high consumption of coal has actually depleted not only the atmosphere of their land, but beyond their natural land. Therefore, there is a possibility, one can actually tie it in, that there has been a breach of Africa's sovereignty, which can actually trigger a legal concern. In this context, extraterritorial obligations of states to actually not to violate or not to harm those beyond their borders. So the question is that, so now what action, what measure can be taken to actually coerce or actually encourage or entreat emission states to actually cut down their emissions? And I'm using the word coerce here very cautiously, simply because, as we know, the Trump administration has actually pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which it's a step, it's a step back from some of the advances which has been made so far. And by pulling out of the Paris Agreement, it actually demonstrates its unwillingness, its lack of political appetite to commit to some of the provisions which are stated in the Paris Agreement. Of course, there are a growing concern or growing sort of support that the newly elected president might actually maybe ratify the instrument again. But the question is that, as we know, that states are quick to actually ratify, but very slow when it comes to implementation and compliance with the agreement that they've actually acceded to. So for the time being, what can Africans do to actually cut down on their emissions? Of course, to some commentators, the available option is to use the COP, that's the Congress of Parties platform, to actually advocate for emissions and reduction. But a clear view of COP, it's evident that there is a platform for unequal parties. It's like you pitching an unstable country like Sudan or Somalia or Zambia against powerful giants like China, India, and US for them to agree on how to cut down on emissions. It's not going to work. And a clear indication can be found in one of the provisions which was actually attached to the Paris Agreement. Because as you know, under Article 8.2 of the Paris Agreement, there is an instrument which is inserted there, which is the Warsaw International Agreement on Financial Agreement for Liability and Claims. So the notion here was that, as its name implies, was to provide some assistance to developing countries to enable them to cope or adapt to some of the impact of climate change. However, there is under this same provision, there was a caveat which was added, that the implementation of this particular provision will be subject to the decisions and authority of COP. And of course, as I said, the COP is automatically a very, I don't want to use treacherous, but it's a very difficult ground. So when this provision was actually at the COP actually came up with an annex attached an additional document to the Paris Agreement, indicating that this provision, that the international mechanism for loss and damage, will not be used as grounds to seek for liability or compensation. Therefore, actually cutting down or mitigating any attempts for poor African countries to actually seek for reparation or to seek for assistance to actually enable them to cope. So whilst I was
Nkrumah, just interrupting, 5-minute warning, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. So in going forward, there is, it appears, a fertile ground which has actually so far not been utilized, and that is actually the Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And actually the committee came out in this 71st session indicating that pollution or any act of or any hazardous activity which tends to actually harm a particular section of a population will be given considerable attention. So, so this kind of, what is this kind of attention? The attention here that the committee seems to purport is that it's ready to actually receive any form of communication or complaint which actually is alleging or that there's been some form of pollution or actually harming or maybe pollution or depletion which is actually affecting a particular population. And so to that end, I'm actually, it's a fertile ground which can be actually be used by Africa's population of young generation to seek for reparation. But there is two actually barriers or hurdles which needs to be crossed before this complaint can be filed. One is the exhaustion of domestic remedies. That before a complaint can be filed before the committee, the complainant must first try to use, have exhausted all the available court within the target state. However, considering that the perpetrators or the target state in this case, we are looking at the 5 highest emitters. That's the China, India, the US. There is no need for you to go through, so one can actually circumvent this barrier and bring it as a form of an interstate communication. The second one is that before the committee can hear your case, the target state need to have made some sort of a declaration that we accept the competence or the ability of this committee to adjudicate. And so far, the 5 emitting states have all made that declaration. So truly, that is a very fertile ground to seek for some form of reparation, to actually on 2 grounds. First, asking the committee to make a ruling that there is a need for states to take radical actions to cut down their emissions. And second, some form of financial compensation to enable Africans to develop better irrigation systems and better bridges to actually contain the flood. And I believe that even if this form of attempt or this form of communication does not get the result that we are looking for, it will serve as the first collective attempt of Africans seeking to actually hold the global north and the Asian world to account for the impact of climate change. Permit me to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nkrumah. You actually, you're ceding a couple of minutes. So, so that's great, particularly since your paper was so rich and I know that you could have gone on for longer. So in the question, in the Q&A, we can come back to some of these, provocative suggestions that you have using the existing international legal structure to address climate change through the CERD, or the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So we're going now from an international sort of register, and we're going to go into much more local, a much more local arena for addressing these questions. And so I'd like to present Dr. Eness Paidamoyo Mutsvangwa-Sammie, who is a postdoc at the University of Pretoria. And she will be presenting a paper entitled Establishing Innovation Labs for Climate Resilience, Building in Semi-Arid Regions of Buhera, Bulilima, and Gutu districts of Zimbabwe. So we have to okay. Yeah, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good morning.
Thank you to my fellow presenters. Okay. So for my paper, I'm focusing on establishing innovation labs in the hope of enhancing innovation capacities for rural livelihoods and natural resource management in semi-arid areas of Zimbabwe. And as Meredith said, focusing on 3 particular districts in Zimbabwe, that is Buhera, Gutu, and so in terms of my outline, I'm going to focus on the background information, the objectives, then the conceptual framework that I used for the paper, the findings, and lastly, the conclusion. So in terms of introduction, I came across this statement in a blog way back in 2007, but I find it fascinating that somehow it still applies even up to now, even after all that we have gone through in terms of trying to improve rural livelihoods. So it reads, agriculture is at the top of the policy agenda in Africa. There is a genuine window of opportunity to demonstrate how a focus on agriculture can promote broad-based rural poverty alleviation, food security, and employment generation. However, there is a constant danger of slipping into uncritical, formulaic, and context-insensitive responses. Now more than ever, this must be avoided. Then in terms of the background and the problem statement, the majority of rural farmers in arid and semi-arid regions of Zimbabwe rely on rain-fed agriculture for their livelihoods, but issues to do with erratic rainfall, the poor soils, resource competition, poor markets, and poorly crafted innovations have led to food insecurity. However, for us to improve, there are certain critical issues that need to be taken into account. Firstly, looking at the biophysical and socio-economic context. Also the discourse and narratives involving innovations. How exactly do people understand or perceive innovations? The projected outputs and the outcomes of these innovations. Then there are also issues to do with emerging and underlying power dynamics. And these really need to be taken into considerations as we rethink or reconceptualize the whole idea of how innovation labs can be set up. Then there's also the issue of the scalability, scaling out and scaling up of these innovations. Then in terms of the objectives, this project was part of a project called Climate Change Adaptation to Rural Livelihoods, and Oxfam and the University of Zimbabwe were partners in this project. So part of the objective was to enhance and strengthen climate resilience capacity in rural semi-arid regions of Buhera, Bulilima, and Gutu districts of Zimbabwe. Specific objectives included conducting a strategic research on pioneering innovations for climate resilience, establishing and operationalizing these innovation labs in each district, and also evaluating the effectiveness of the innovation labs in building capacities in climate resilience, and in turn delivering solutions to livelihood challenges. For this particular paper, I focused on the first part, whereby we did a scoping exercise to try to find out from the people on the ground, the different stakeholders, the farmers, the extension workers, the NGOs and other service providers, the private sector, to try and find out exactly what has been going on, what innovations or interventions are being promoted, and how this was worked out for these communities. So it's basically based on that. I didn't focus on the other two objectives because I wasn't part of the project anymore. Then in terms of the justification, there is need to bridge the gap between research, development, and rural farming systems through participatory approaches that lead to context-specific innovations and in turn improved rural livelihoods. A successful development and resilience building strategy has to build extensive innovation capacities to foster growth and embedded innovation in the main field rather than remain a fringe investment, just something on the peripheral, which is not quite the central core. And I believe that's where we have been missing it. Then in terms of the study areas, I've already alluded to the districts, and this is where they are placed in Zimbabwe. Then the conceptual framework, it was as follows. We're looking at the vulnerability context to try and understand the climatic shocks, seasonality, and the trends that were experienced in these areas, then the livelihood exposure and sensitivity, and also try to identify what the drivers were in terms of the livelihood assets, the existing policies and institutions, and also look at the capacities to be developed, what exactly needs to be developed or enhanced or strengthened. Then also look at the improved outcomes, what exactly would come out of setting up those innovation labs at the different levels. Yeah. Then when we went into the field, these were some of the interventions that we came across, like the roof harvesting, like those big tanks, harvesting water from the tanks, and it would be used for household use, the gardens, homestead gardens, then also infield water harvesting techniques, then infiltration pits, then the banana grass, which is used to feed livestock, and also the labu, which is used also for supplementary feeding for livestock. Then other interventions included pen fattening, farmer groups that were there, then water sand abstraction to irrigate the gardens, and also fodder and silage making. So in terms of the findings, what we got when we got there was that there were episodes of many actors promoting the same technology at the same time. You get into one community, you realize that there are different players who are promoting the same thing. Then also more of crop and not livestock-based innovations were being promoted. And this was quite surprising, considering that these areas are more, they are more favorable for livestock production than crop production. If it's crop production, it has to be irrigated because rain-fed agriculture is erratic and unreliable. Then also the rural landscape tends to be characterized by a variety of households with different resources and needs, which we felt that it was something that needs to be taken into account as you enter a community with whatever intervention that you have, to know that these are people at they have different needs, and they're at different levels in terms of resources. So we had a bit of recommendations that we wrote out as well for the different players that we thought were critical in this innovation process. Like for the donors, to allow for flexible arrangement by promoting commissioned and non-commissioned approaches that can unlock innovation, and also place a premium on projects that show an integrated approach to problem solving. Because when you talk to some of the NGO officers, they'll, why are you continuing maybe promoting this particular intervention, even if you guys believe, or even if the communities are saying it's not really working out for them, then they will say it's because that's what the donor wants. That's what if you speak the language of the donors, then you get the money. But if you come up with some other ideas, you might not get the money. So we felt that there should be some form of flexibility so that people can actually innovate around some of these techniques that are promoted in the communities. Then for policymakers, we felt that there's need to encourage a more holistic approach to development, which is all encompassing somehow. Then for researchers, design innovations that take account of the diversified livelihood strategies, including both farm and non-farm based incomes. Because there is a huge assumption that is often made that rural farmers are, it's equal to farming. There's nothing else that they do. But there are so many things that they do. From a study that I did for my PhD, about 30% was from agriculture, then the rest was from off-farming activities and non-farming activities. Then the local extension department and local NGOs, we felt that they should support livelihood-based extension rather than commodity-based strategies. Then in terms of setting up the innovation labs, in terms of conceptualizing exactly how it would work, we felt that stakeholders might be the farmers, the private sector, the extension officers, the NGOs. They focus on whatever challenge a community is facing. They analyze that problem, then they conceptualize this problem so that they have the same understanding of what the problem entails and exactly how to go about it in addressing it. So then they design or make the prototype, which they test, then they give feedback and improve if necessary. Then if it's now okay, then they can scale out to the rest of the community.
Dr. Mutsvangwa-Sammie, sorry to interrupt, just about a 3-minute warning for you.
Okay.
So you're at the conclusion, so.
Yeah. So in terms of setting out the innovation platforms, the stakeholders suggested that a focus on the following interventions would be ideal. That is interventions that enable access to better information, technical knowledge that improve entrepreneurship, that integrate climate information to farmers planning, and also keeping in mind that diversity in interventions creates options and alternatives for farmers, taking into account that, as we alluded to earlier, that communities or households are at different levels and priorities can also be different, with some prioritizing food security and others going a step further to prioritize income generation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Also very respectful of the time, much appreciated. So we'll have a fertile discussion, most likely. But before we get to the discussion and the Q&A, I would like to introduce, last but not least, Dr. Yves Nabulya of Makerere University, who will be presenting on Ganda performance literature in response to the environmental crisis. So good morning, and you have the floor.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm just glad to be here, well, to be there or to be wherever with you. Yes, and I think I'll be sharing my screen quiet now. Yes, this paper is this paper does. Oh my dear. Okay. So I began from the last slide. Yes, we're getting there soon. Okay. Yes, it's a Ghana performance literature in response to the environmental crisis. And so this paper discusses convictions. It discusses convictions and propositions of the Baganda expressed in their folk tales performed on the subject of climate change and environmental degradation. So the research takes place in Uganda and in central Uganda. And the Baganda are one of the major ethnic groups living around Lake Victoria, which is supposed to be a very rich, well, I would say, very rich area, green rich area. It was surrounded by forests until up to maybe 10 years ago. But all those forests have been lost. I don't know whether to the Chinese, I don't know, but they have been lost. And now the communities only have to remember that they had forests around them. Now, this research is part of a larger project that investigates environmental wisdom among the, well, in Uganda. So in this map here, this is the part that Uganda occupies. It's central part and it's supposed to be, it's around this lake. So it is supposed to be rich, but now it is being affected by climate change. And the communities which I did, amongst which I did research, are farming communities that feel the pinch of climate change. So to collect the data, I used key informant interviews, and then I attended the folktale performances, recorded, and then transcribed the stories. And then that's how I'm able to have them. And so the data that what we're going to discuss comes from those stories that have been performed. Now, to clarify a bit, these as we call them folk stories or folk tales, but they are not the type that is passed on from generation to generation, like from I don't know when. These are composed in real time. I mean, they are composed in this contemporary time. And the community the communities in which I was working have a practice of storytelling that is promoted by the Buganda Kingdom, just because it was the traditional form of education. And so it's promoted by the kingdom, and so it's alive and going. Yeah, the pictures that we see here show how badly the forests have all been erased, you know. Now, the country, Uganda, is already undergoing the effects of climate change. In the picture here, we see cattle that are very emaciated in the northern part of the country, and fields that eventually dry. I mean, before the maize fruits can dry, you know, and incidentally, after long droughts, then there's also sometimes a lot of rain that causes landslides and also floods. Now, like in this picture here, a dispensary is eroded, and of course, when the floods come, people, you know, there are patients in the dispensary, and well, now all those people die, and well, some people survive, but you know, it's a terrible disaster. So that's how bad it is. So the people in Uganda, therefore, are aware. They are aware that well, the effects of climate change and of how bad that the things are going to get, because all the environment is being devastated. Now, the issues, the environmental issues in Uganda, mainly it is deforestation and maybe wetland. It's wetland draining, and it is pollution. Those are the main issues. And so what we have today, when people perform these stories in their communities, it kind of, you sense that they are aware that things are bad, but they tell stories and represent landscapes that are not existing anymore. So what you find in the stories are lush green hills and forests that are full of fruits, and this is not there anymore. And so, like when one of the performances, the storyteller said, in the neighborhood there was a very big forest and with fresh waters, and then plenty of wild fruits and all that. And it all now sounds very romantic, because they're talking about an environment that is long gone. And so then I read this as in light with the 18th century romantic literature, that literature which came up as after the first industrial revolution, when individuals felt that they missed the countryside, they missed the nature and to be in communion with nature, and looks like there's a general feeling of nostalgia in these stories. That's what I sense. Yeah, they also, of course, the stories also tell you about rare plant species, and they tell you about animals and wild game and wild animals all in the forest, and then you don't see them anymore. Well, they are okay. Now I shouldn't give a wrong impression. In Uganda, there are of course national parks where those animals right now are, but they used also to live in the forests among the people. Now, like things like monkeys and baboons, those ones were very common. Even when I was growing up, you would travel from the capital city Kampala to somewhere in Masaka, where my home is. That is about 100 kilometers. And then on the road, you would find these baboons and monkeys. They would fly, they would cross the road and all that. Now that cannot be seen anymore. But now, of course, we have some animals still left in those secluded areas. So now I then therefore note that the landscape in the folktales is completely different from what is on the ground. And that's against reality, and the language, the landscape that emerges from the narrations is very rich, which in a way makes you feel that the storytellers are kind of trying to paint a picture of the ideal landscape they would like to have. Kind of an ideal landscape, or in another way, you can imagine, you can begin to look at it as a way of painting a picture of how far we have fallen from ecological grace. So it paints a picture of where we were or where we would like to be, and where and then how far we've gone away from the goal. And so that is the mood in the story, that when you listen to the stories, that's the mood that you get. Okay, now the article also goes on to discuss the projections. Yes, it goes on to discuss the projections of and consequences of disrupting the natural ecosystem in light of apocalyptic rhetoric. Well, the stories that in the stories, you listen, when you listen to the stories, many of them, there's always people who violate environmental and ecological values, and they get punished. I can give examples, very many of the stories, but in one example, a woman who is having only male children, wants to have now girl children, so she goes to a diviner who advises her to go to a particular mountain and that has a lot of herbs, and she's warned not to pick more than one type of herb. And when she does, she's attacked by ants, in a way like they're soldiers which are guarding this great mountain. And now what I found interesting about that kind of story is that it is a way of talking about sustainability. So the kind of these stories, people are aware of the need to control exploitation. Similarly, there's also another story where there's a famine, and so children, in some families, children are sent to go and pick wild fruits. And it's a family, so people, of course, are greedy if you want. But now there's a taboo in these forests where they have to pick these fruits, that if you pick more than one type, then you will be punished. But now the children don't know what will happen. So they test that. So they pick mangoes, and they also pick oranges. And what happens? They lose their way, and they meander in the wild, and until one of them finds the way home. But the rest of them, according to the story, disappear in the forest. I mean, they cannot get home. So eventually, even when the community finds them, they have turned into monkeys. They fly around like monkeys. They don't want to come down from the treetops. And so that's how they are lost. So now that kind of punishment is a kind of death. Because the children change form, then they are no longer humans, according to the story. They are kind of monkeys. And in another story, the punishment is death, actually. Now, in this particular story, and I think about three of the 30 stories I have, people are not allowed to cut particular trees from forests because there are always forests where they're forbidden from cutting trees. And now in this one case, a man cuts a tree and it falls on him and he dies. But what is dramatic is that the tree actually goes back on its roots. And so such stories are there where people are punished for abusing the elements of the natural environment. And so this is what I read it to understand it. This is what I understand about this kind of representation. Now, while environmentalist reading of African literature usually concentrates on situations in which corporate bodies, including former colonial masters, neo-colonial agents, and imperialists or multinational companies are implicated in the abuse and destruction of African environments, these stories actually do implicate the individual. They do not point fingers at, corporate bodies or whoever. It's like everybody is responsible for safeguarding the environment, and if you violate you are punished. And so the idea of punishing people and individuals at that eventually calls or kind of reaches out to the rhetoric of apocalypse that is very common in environmental writings. Now, there are two modes of apocalypse, as according to two scholars, that is Greg Garrard and Frederick Bell. And one mode is called tragic apocalypse, and the other one is comic, after a Greek drama. Now, the tragic one is where it is always a kind of a catastrophic ending of things. And usually in the tragic apocalypse, there is no warning. Once you violate these rules of nature, you are destroyed, and this doesn't destroy an individual, it destroys a whole community. But now there's another form of apocalyptic rhetorical writing, and this one is less gloomy. At least it's a way of kind of warning. So people who the culprits are punished in such a way that they would stop environmental abuse. So now these stories that I read here kind of play into that understanding of environmental ethics, because in all of them actually, not whole communities disappear. the punishment is always to individuals in ways that it deters them from violating environmental values. So I then read this as a way.
Sorry, 2 minutes, just to. 2 minutes.
So this mode of environmentalism in Uganda folktales is kind of a form of individual ecological morality that eventually now invokes Anne Nash's notion of ecosophy. In this idea of philosophy or ideology of ecosophy, that the Norwegian scholar Anne Nash, that is the proponent of deep ecology, explains it as a philosophy of ecological harmony and equilibrium, which comprises norms and rules and principles concerning human relations with the natural environment. So it's kind of an individual thing. And for me, these values which aim at the individual, in a way, like if each one of us develops individual morality or ecosophy, so eventually now we will all become accountable at the level of the individual, and therefore the community and the society eventually will be reconstructed. So societal ecology then can be constructed from ecosophy. Otherwise, so finally I conclude that these stories, the Uganda stories that we have, that I look at, form a representation, or they play out the philosophy of the individual ecology, that is ecosophy as per Anne Nash's. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all of you presenters. So we have plenty of time. We actually have 35 minutes, I believe, for Q&A. So I'm hoping that we can get some good questions from those of you in attendance, but I also would like to say to each of the panelists that you're very much encouraged to ask questions of each other as well. So your papers they each have different approaches, but in some ways the problem is similar. So this may be a productive time for you to ask questions of each other. So in terms of how to ask questions, of course, you can use the chat and I can relay the questions to the panelists. You can also raise your hand or ask to be unmuted, and Danielle can unmute you so that you can bring your voice into this discussion this morning. So I don't see anyone jumping to ask anything. So what I would like to do is ask a question myself. I don't want to dominate this discussion time by any means. I don't want to use my position as chair to sort of monopolize the conversation, but at the same time, I'd like us to use up the time, and I would like to engage with these very important contributions on the topic of climate justice as racial justice. So I will go ahead and ask the first question, and those of you in attendance can prepare your questions as I do so. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Nkrumah, because you know, you sort of laid out the problem of the youth, African youth, you know, as on the end of an unjust climate change orchestrated by, you know, the worst polluters, the Americans, the Chinese, etc. And then you proposed this international human rights law sort of formula of solution, which is through the Committee of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And it called to mind for me this petition that was brought by 15 children in September 2019 to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, using the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so I saw some parallels there in terms of just the maneuver. And I was wondering if you could say more about these adjudication processes. It sounds like there are some ongoing, right, through CERD, and how successful they are. And you also said that they're successful insofar as countries recognize the right of this committee to adjudicate. And I wondered if you could say more about that. What countries and are the worst polluters among those countries that recognize the committee on the elimination of racial discrimination's right to adjudicate?
Thank you, Jay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's a very interesting question, and I was actually looking forward to actually speaking more on it, but just that my time was quite limited. So it's of course, then we know that the worst two countries which are the highest emitters are China and the US, and surprisingly, I went through all the existing international instruments, and in most instances, the US has not ratified most of these instruments in most cases. And even where they have, for instance, in terms of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they have not made such a declaration recognizing the Human Rights Committee to make such pronouncement. So I actually tried to even use the International Court of Justice, but such a declaration does not exist. The only committee where such a declaration has been made was the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That is the only one. And that is the only one which has all the 5 highest emitters making such a declaration. So it appears that there is a very narrow path which can be used. And then that is the only one, that's the only, what you call international instrument, body which with this institution actually recognize. But then there is also a bit of a problem. The question is that you also actually ask for how this process is carried out. And of course, I believe you, all the panelists and our participants know that you go through a communication process. And of course, the youth might need some assistance in this regard because they might not know the news and crust of as to how to draft a communication, as to the procedure, the procedural and the structural, or the content, the substantive aspect of it. So partnership with civil societies, which do have an experience in this sector, would help. But there is some aspect of, it is not guaranteed that the committee will be able to get compliance, because we know that the US and of course the powerful countries or the big 5, the Security Council members often do not always comply with international institutions. And it's obvious that there's a possibility that even when this decision is handed down, let's just hope Joe Biden might be very much more flexible in terms of his compliance to climate change. But of course, even if it's just still Trump, there's very little doubt that existing international institutions will be able to encourage him to ensure compliance. But my concern, the only setback with the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination is that it can be classified as a quasi-judicial committee. Its decisions are not binding, but however, it has the power of actually mobilizing the international community to actually mount pressure on a state which does not comply with this decision, because once it hands down a decision, it sends copies to all the various UN international institutions, the agencies, that such a decision has been made, and they also send rapporteurs or experts to go and monitor the compliance, the level of compliance which the state is actually taking to comply with this decision. And if in a situation where the experts goes and like a field what you call to survey or to monitor, but when the expert sees that the level of compliance is not adequate, the Commission can actually make further recommendations, which I believe it can actually, to some extent, it can mobilize support at the UN General Assembly, and of course, all the human rights bodies to actually put some pressure when it comes to state reporting from the target state. So I believe at this point, that is the only avenue which I believe something which should be looked into. And I believe maybe scholars can also actually interrogate it further going forward. But thank you for the question. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much. So again, I'd like to invite any participants with questions or any of the panelists. I have more questions, but I'd be very happy to continue to ask questions about these papers, but I do want to give a chance to others. So I just shared, while others are maybe thinking, I just shared the link to the parallel case. Like I just see this parallel legal strategy going through the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Rights of the Child through this petition. That I don't know where the petition is or how it's been, dealt with or adjudicated, but I just thought it was interesting to think through that as a parallel to what you're explaining, Dr. Nkrumah. Okay, so we have a question from Dr. Falase to everyone. What can Africa and Africa's youth do indigenously to prevent the effects of emitters since legal actions are not, or the effects of emission since legal actions are not effective? And that's an interesting question coming from you, Dr. Falase, because actually it relates to a question that I had for you. Because I think what you bring out in your paper is how important it is to get policymakers and government officials to listen to the right people, the scientists, the development analysts, etc., who have the knowledge and expertise of exactly what is happening to the forests, to Africa's forests now. So just to relate to that question that you posed, the question that I had for you is how does that work? How can governments be made to listen, right, to the scientists, the development analysts, and the other experts that you elaborate in your paper? Because one thing that can be done, obviously, is for that expertise to be generated, but how does it make a connection to the policymakers?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an interesting question. I think first and foremost, the government needs to be serious about considering the forest sector as one of the most important sectors in the country or in the continent. Because as it is, attention has been diverted to oil and other major natural resources, and forest has been neglected to some extent. And there are a lot of issues that are going on in forest governance system. So another thing that the government must first of all do before we can even talk about, talking about this kind of policy is first and foremost to integrate the informal institutions, the informal actors into the forest governance system. In most African countries, particularly in Nigeria, the state is the overall controller of the forest. The state government is the overall controller of the forest, and they are regarded as the former actor. Now, other actors, other forest stakeholders have been, marginalized, dispossessed in the process. So a lot of issues, before government can, listen by, taking into consideration the importance of the scientists, the foresters, the local communities, they must first of all, see the importance of these people. After seeing the importance of these people, we can all say, okay, these people also are part of the key actors that must be there when issues on infrastructure, stroke forest dealings are being made. So I think first and foremost, the government needs to understand the concept of development. Development is multifaceted. And to different people, development means a lot of things. So I don't know, through policy paper to publications, the government can, know what people are talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from a participant in the audience. It's from Dr. Obi. How do we address concerns for climate justice within African countries in two regards? The state of climate-sensitive legal frameworks and the wholesome embrace of investments built on energy guzzling and polluting activities, factories, by governments keen on rapid industrialization. Please also reflect on the role of the extractive sector, including oil and mining. That's a very broad question. It almost reads, you know, as much as like a comment. I don't know if Dr. Obi would like to speak. But are there any panelists who would like to take up that question?
Okay, if I may. Yes, thank you so much. And so the question is you highlighted, it seems like it has two arms. So in terms of the first one, and maybe that ties into Olugbenga's question as to what can Africa's youth or what can Africans do domestically in terms of how to mitigate climate change. And I think so far, there is a growing movement of young people who are actually taking to the streets and demonstrating, joining this climate strike action where students even don't go to school on Fridays to join Greta Thunberg's climate change movement. So there is a growing movement, there's a renaissance of young people who are actually taking their respective governments to account. And besides that, there are some students or young people who are actually now taking some participatory roles in local climate action plans, where they're actually contributing using various platforms, advocacy campaigns and all that to actually encourage governments to, local governments to domestic or to actually adopt policies which are climate friendly. So to that extent, I think there is a movement today, and we should be grateful that, and also to the extent that Africa does not emit so much, greenhouse gases. I think so far South Africa is number 11 on the scale. So there is, to some extent, and even then, there are some students at VET or across the country who are still agitating for emissions to be cut down. And if you go to the extractive industries, I think so far there has been some effort in this direction. If maybe one can recall, in the case of Syrac versus Nigeria, where the African Commission was actually held Nigerian government accountable for polluting the water sources of the Ogoni people. So, and since then, there is some still mining activities going on. But if you look at these mining activities carefully, most of those doing the power brokers behind these mining activities are not Africans themselves, but the investors. And who are these investors? So it all ties in with our argument as to if it's possible, the African governments are supposed to, they are obliged to actually adopt instruments which can actually control the activities of third parties, regulate the conduct of industries. And where they fail to do so, then they become actually liable or complicit in the whole process. So to some extent, I think there is a movement. The young people are doing what they can. They actually are very agitating for climate action plans and for more climate friendly conditions. And then also, but then we need as Africans or as Africanists to also lobby that the private sector, those investors from Asia and the Western world, they try to not to, it's a very difficult to use this word, but they come with policies or with actions which do not further, exacerbate our already worsening condition. I will look at that.
Okay, thank you very much. So Dr. Nabulya has written, okay, let me come back to Dr. Obi and we'll get Danielle to facilitate your speech, taking speech. But first, let's go to Dr. Nabulya, who is writing, one of the key issues regarding environmental challenges is a lack of information to the general public. I wonder whether there are mechanisms of enhancing awareness in your context. So I think that's really interesting to ask that question, because the last two papers did raise this question of, how to involve the greater public, even at the grassroots or the rural level, in sort of taking ownership of this problem and participating in its resolution. So would anyone like to speak to that comment?
Please, can you highlight the question, repeat yourself?
Okay, sorry. It's appearing in the chat, but maybe not everyone can see. So Dr. Nabulya, who is one of the panelists, actually, she says one of the key issues regarding environmental challenges is lack of information to the general public. I wonder whether there are mechanisms of enhancing awareness in your contacts. And I think that she was directing this mostly at Dr. Falase, if I'm not mistaken. But I think that anyone could speak to it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think one of the problems that most African governments have, or most communities, local communities, or forest-dependent communities have, is that they see any policy, any forest policy, especially to control deforestation, as anti-policy. They see it as anti-policy. The importance of anti-deforestation policies is strange to them. So that is why at times they contribute also immensely to the rate of deforestation by farming in the forests or by any other means that also that can deplete the forest more. So there is no monitoring mechanism, from the government to the local people in the context of forest sector or forest governance. So that is what I can say. No monitoring mechanism from the government, and that is exactly what I also mentioned when I was doing the presentation. That most Chinese logging complaints, go beyond the boundary. Initially, they get the approval of the government, but at the end of the day, they acquire through various strategies more land, more concessions from the existing local African elite. So that factor is there. So there no proper monitoring mechanism that has been put in place to checkmate any environmental challenges in Africa, so to say.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Obi, who's asked to speak.
Thank you very much. I actually wanted to be a fly on the wall, but apparently I have to say a few words. Thank you, Dr. Nkrumah, for your very interesting paper. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to approach this from two perspectives. The first is the legal perspective, and I was actually hoping I could provoke you enough to make a commentary on the state of climate justice in two regards. With it, first, the role of the African judiciaries, the judges, how much are they aware of some of these things? And in terms of the jurisprudence, are they really implementing climate justice when cases of such nature are brought before them? What are the enabling laws? What is the enabling legal framework within African countries to actually provide a basic foundation for the kind of global activism that you want the youth to be able to effectively play? I think that is where my question is. And I'm drawing on the experience of Nigeria's Niger Delta, where some communities actually try to take big companies to court for pollution or for degradation. And what you find out is that the processes took decades, and the best lawyers were being recruited by these companies. And at the end of the day, most of the communities were frustrated. And we had a very interesting situation whereby to get environmental justice and climate justice, communities in Nigeria had to go to courts in Holland and in the United States. So that is where I'm coming from, that youth activism is good, but there has to be some kind of legal framework. Probably what I'm gesturing to is the need for youth activism to target the legal framework to see how enabling laws and enabling environment and the legal training of lawyers and judges would actually take some of this on board. The second issue I was then talking about is the whole question of the role of the state. Well, in all your three papers, the role of the state is critical. Whether you are talking about global activism, whether you are talking about what local people can do about their environments in Zimbabwe or in Uganda, and what the Chinese are doing in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, the role of the state in Africa is very, very central. And we need to begin to take on board in our analysis the role of the state and the political context within which we want this environmental and climate justice changes. The third thing goes back to Dr. Nkrumah is the whole question of the principles that we have. A lot of the international principles are voluntary. There are no sanctions for violators. I don't know whether you want any comments on this. The whole question of accountability is very key, but accountability without responsibility is an issue that has to be addressed. If polluters and degraders are not liable to be sanctioned, of course, in Nigeria, there is a fine for emission for gas flaring, but a lot of studies have confirmed that it's much cheaper for the polluters to pay the fine than to actually do anything to stop it. And so that is something that I wanted to raise to you. I hope I'm not being too provocative. The last issue I would like to talk about is the very nature of our natural resources, natural resource governance, and the fact that economics sometimes transforms our economic or our natural resources into commodities for the global market. And so there is a dilemma here. Do you sell what you have and develop, or do you do environmentally responsible development, which would be much more difficult, much more expensive, and will take much more time? And my last bit of the issue was people want to industrialize. Africa wants to catch up, and you're not telling Africa not to pollute like those who are highly industrialized polluted in the past. Where is the morality here? I'm just trying to be a devil's advocate, even though I'm not the devil. But these are issues that I think we can reflect on more seriously. And I don't know if I'm helping, but I'm just bringing this to your attention as a way of actually bringing climate justice, because I think climate justice is very, very important. And even though Africa is not contributing that much to the pollution at the global level and to climate change, Africa is paying the highest cost for the consequences. And therefore, we do have something to do about this. Thank you so much, Meredith. You are very generous. All the best. I stop here.
Thank you to Dr. Obi for that very useful feedback. It's very valuable, so you're generous as well. So I don't know which one of you would like to take up these provocative comments first.
May I?
Please.
Dr. Obi, it's a very, very, very contentious matter. I mean, issues that you raised there, and one has to actually scratch his head to come up with a response. But I think we are obliged to try and respond to some of your questions. Certainly not all, but we will do the needful. In terms of the first question, I think you raised 5 critical points, and then the first one that you were concerned with was whether African judges are actually aware of these legal frameworks and whether they do actually apply them in their adjudication. And it's a difficult question. It's a very difficult question, because I do not have data to actually back up my assertions. But then I believe that there is a growing number of judges and of course lawyers who are actually acquainting themselves with issues relating to environmental laws. And there are, of course, so to that extent, I would say, and drawing from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, I think there is some sort of awareness, which is actually being garnered to some extent, because the Ogoni case took place, it was somewhere in the early 2000s, and if the African Commission was able to evolutively or creatively interpret the African and People's Charter to give reparation to the people of Ogoni, then to some extent I can say that there has been some sort of awareness in this direction, and then we are not so backwards when it comes to environmental law and climate justice. So I think that to some extent there has been some progress in that regard. And in number two, the question was the question of implementation. You mentioned implementation, and I think it's difficult. It depends. There is no African police, or there is no international police. Of course, there is Interpol, but Interpol cannot go and arrest a state when a decision is not complied with. And so in the case of like the African Commission, Nigeria to some extent wanted to comply and not comply. It was a very difficult bone of contention. So, but I believe that the essence of having or winning a case is not so merely about the content of or compliance with what is stated, but the power which gives to the victims. It gives them a sense of relief. It sort of gives, it empowers you that, of course, you are not so wrong. To some extent, your right has been recognized as being violated by a government, which to some extent, it actually gives you, it enhances your entitlement. So even if the state does not comply, as we've seen in so many instances where there is some tension between the executive and the judiciary, to some extent, it empowers the citizens to some extent. And you mentioned the role of the state. Absolutely, the state is the primary custodian of the natural resources, and of course, the custodian of his people. It has the ultimate mandate or the obligation to protect the citizens. So it needs to adopt all the relevant instruments, institutions, and the steps to ensure that its citizens live in a very healthy environment. But of course, this is not always the case. We found instances where government actually collude, or they actually partner with investors or third parties and actually violate the rights of the citizens that they've actually swore or they've actually promised to protect. So it's not always a guaranteed situation. And then you also mentioned that at the international regime, the international instruments are normally principles which are not binding, and it's very difficult to ensure compliance. And I beg to differ. Not all the instruments are soft laws; they are hard laws. The ones when you say a treaty, I believe the treaties are all hard laws and they are binding. And like the ICCPR, the International Convention on Economic and Social Rights, they are all binding. The UNFCCC, it's binding. The Paris Agreement is all binding. But the question is as to the question of implementation. And then I think that's why the framers or the authors of this instrument also always insert a monitoring mechanism to ensure compliance with these instruments. And then that is why actually Meredith mentioned the children approaching the Committee on Children's Rights. And I believe that is a step which it's commendable. It's the first step, and I believe it's going to garner momentum and actually encourage more activism, not just at the local level, but across the international level. Because so far, there is a movement at the national level. What if you look at Juliana versus the United States, and in Asia and in Canada, there is a growing movement of young people who are holding their governments accountable. But as you rightly noted, Africa's emission is very, very less. So holding African governments to accountable at this point in time might lead to further, limiting of emissions, but not what we're looking for. We're looking for the massive reduction, radical step towards it. And if we are looking for the radical reduction, it means that we must take radical step. And at this point, we cannot take this sort of litigation to the African Commission or the African Court. It's because these bodies do not have jurisdiction over the states in the global north or over Asia. We need to reach to a higher power, which in this case, the only countries or the only body which has been recognized by these powerful countries is only said. So that is our only alternative. But I think I will leave the rest of the questions to the rest of the panelists to also address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask two questions. One to Dr. Nabulya, and I put it in the chat, but I can read it. My question for you is regarding, I'm trying to get an idea of who who's telling these stories in the community, who's making them up, and who is the audience, who's listening to them, you know, because it's such a powerful tool, right, to increase public awareness, as you were saying in your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, who tells the story? I mean, the ordinary people. If you want the folk, they are folk tales, and so they are folk. What I would say is that, you know, traditionally in Uganda, that was the traditional means of education. And so now what happens is that, of course, modernity and the change of, you know, I mean, the economic setup and all that has eventually eroded much of oral literature. But now in this particular community is the Buganda kingdom, which is kind of holding together the cultural values of these people, is sponsoring those programs. And so they're encouraging these storytelling sessions. And so people have an extra motivation to get together in the evenings after work, to sit down together and tell stories. Otherwise, in other communities that I went to, the culture of storytelling is really very limited. And because, you know, they don't have any motivation. So in this particular communities, because the Uganda government is sponsoring the event and they have community kind of assistants who go around, you know, just visiting people and say, well, come on, we have a session here. So people come, they make up the stories. And usually, I think it's entertainment, but I think I found it also very educative. Especially because now in this case, in my research, I told them that when I visit them, when I come to attend their performances, I would like to listen to their stories that talk to issues of environmental degradation. And so they did not now tell me that those other stories, because they usually have many. So those who had stories about forests, about animals, and they're the ones who now told stories that time. But I could see that the stories were contemporary. There were not those other stories where the ogres eat people and all that, but somehow they were also keeping within the mode of and the symbolism of the older stories, of the older traditional stories, but they were made up and they were contemporary. And the audience is still, you know, they made there about 20 people or 10 people with their children. So they are the audience and they are the tellers. There are no professional performers for that matter.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Mutsvangwa-Sammie, would you like to, we're almost running out of time, but would you like to speak to my question about the success that communities are having in making their own expertise and innovation known to donors and accepted by donors? Let's see.
Sorry, okay. I'll give an example of conservation agriculture. It has been greatly promoted in Zimbabwe since early 2000. But then what has been happening is it has just been an issue of the promoters changing its name. This time around, they come with a different name. Then when they're promoting it the second time, they come with a different name. But what I found fascinating was farmers taking some of the techniques that are used in conservation agriculture, instead of using them in the large plots that they felt it was too labor intensive and they couldn't cope with the amount of work. They took those same techniques and integrated them with what they were doing in their small gardens. And they realized that it was working quite well for them, to an extent that even this year in Zimbabwe, conservation agriculture is being promoted widely. Even my own dad was telling me that he was given inputs for conservation agriculture, and they've given it another name. But this time around, they've realized that promoting it in the large fields doesn't work. So it's better to scale it down in terms of concentrating the little resources people have on smaller plots. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those explanations. And thank you again for this panel. These are very enlightening contributions, all of them. And of course, we will be in touch after the panel to discuss further. Thank you for the feedback from the participants, which was very useful. And Dr. Obi, Dr. Falase is thanking Dr. Obi and has responded to you in the chat as well. So we're out of time, I'm afraid. So I wish you an enjoyable rest of the day at the conference today, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.